We're going to again talk tonight about a very special project, the Convention of the States. And Mark Meckler is the president of Citizens for Self-Governance, their website, conventionofstates.com. And before we give people the news, the big story of the day, there are still a lot of people who are not aware of what this is all about. So, Mark, I suppose we should probably start by simply taking a look first at the fact that there are an awful lot of reforms that could not probably become constitutional amendments the traditional way, which is to say by going through Congress initially, simply because a lot of them affect Congress, and Congress isn't about to do so. Would you not agree?
Yeah, Jim, I agree with that. All the most basic reforms that the American people have wanted literally for decades, things like term limits or a balanced budget amendment or simple things like making sure Congress can't exempt themselves from the laws they pass.
No budget, no pay. That's another one.
Yeah, so these are all things that the American people broadly support. Congress will never impose those sorts of things on themselves.
So if you check out the old rule book, there are precise ways in which you can amend the Constitution. We've done it 27 times, and we have always started out by having a two-thirds vote of the House and a two-thirds vote of the Senate to recommend changes. Then it goes to the states, where three-quarters of the state legislatures have to give an okay. That's how we've amended the Constitution the times that we have. There is, however, in the Constitution, very valid, very much a part of that document, another way of starting the ball rolling. What is that?
Well, it's interesting because the part you just read is the part that was in the Constitution as of September 15th, 1787, 2 days before the end of the convention. Colonel George Mason from Virginia stood up and addressed the men assembled and said that they'd made a terrible mistake because they had forgotten to include a way for the states and the people acting through their states to propose amendments. And he asked a question of the men assembled. He asked, are we so naive that we believe that a government that becomes a tyranny will propose the right kinds of amendments to restrain its own tyranny? It's pretty much what you started this segment with. Of course, they never will. And the men there knew that. It was just as obvious to them as it is to us today. Madison's notes reflect in Latin the words nin com, which means there was no debate, no comment about that. And in fact, unanimously, they voted to give the states, two-thirds of the states who make an application to Congress for a convention of states, the right to call a convention to propose amendments.
Now, and we're going to talk a bit about the progress that's being made on that front, which is incidentally considerable. I'm curious, of all the things that have been put forward, and there have been a lot of proposed constitutional amendments, 27, of course, have made it, and one of those was merely a repeal of one of the others. So why is it that this hasn't been used before?
You know, I think the big reason is it's tough. It's really hard to get two-thirds of the states to even call a convention and then three-quarters of states to ratify anything. It's a really high bar, and it requires a very specific process. And I think that the most simple reason I can give you is no project ever before in American history has tried to do it in a very coordinated, grassroots, 50-state national way. That's being done today for the first time in American history.
1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. And so you have the website, conventionofstates.com. This is something that is being proposed to happen, and beyond being proposed to happen. This is something which very much looks like it is going to happen. So at this point, let us have Mark Meckler give us the big news about the Convention of States project.
Yeah, incredible. Just this week, we surpassed 3 million supporters nationally. More amazing to me than the number 3 million, which I think is extraordinary, Jim, when you think this project's only existed for 4 years. More extraordinary is where they are. This is the first project in American history that has supporters in literally every single state legislative district in the United States of America. That means every single state legislator in this country has people in their district, more than one, numerous people in their district that are calling them and requesting that they make this application for a convention.
That is pretty remarkable. I assume that one can express that support by going to the website, conventionofstates.com?
Yeah, people go there and they get signed up. What they can do is sign the petition. That petition will automatically go to their state representative, their state senator, and so they can make it known to those folks. That's the best way to get involved, that you want them to call that convention.
Mm-hmm. We might as well bring up now a boogeyman, a straw man that has been brought up time and time again, always by the opponents. Oh, what if you had a runaway convention? Oh, who knows what they might do? And again, it has to be driven home to the opponents and also people who just don't know that a constitutional convention cannot change the Constitution. It can recommend changes. But, Mark, if it recommends something wild and crazy like only left-handed people can vote or cross-eyed people are exempt from being on juries or whatever, anything that's really stupid is never going to get through 38 states.
No, it's not. Here's the important thing to know. I call this actually, Jim, a suggesting convention. Anybody who's scared of this says they're scared of the states getting together and making suggestions about limitations on the federal government. Now, I think that's crazy. It takes only 13 states to stop anything because it takes 38 to ratify. So if 13 states say no, then nothing becomes part of the Constitution. And I can tell you from working in 41 state legislatures over the last couple of years, doing nothing is what they like to do best. And that's how they say no. They don't even have to vote on it. Just by simply not discussing, it doesn't get ratified. And whether you come from the left or the middle or the right, there are 13 states that would stop anything that's far to either side of the center.
So again, nothing wild could come out of a constitutional convention that would actually become a part of the Constitution. This is the recommending phase, and it's the ratification phase that makes all the difference in the world. Mark Meckler, again, is president of Citizens for Self-Governance and is one of the nation's most effective grassroots activists. He, after he co-founded and was the national coordinator of the Tea Party Patriots, he founded Citizens for Self-Governance to revolutionize American government. This goes back to February of 2012, and this grassroots initiative expands and directs the ever-growing bipartisan self-governance movement. I want to look at that one line from the material provided about your organization. How bipartisan is it? Because let's face it, most of the recommendations that we are talking about are recommendations that would probably be aimed at curbing the authority of the federal government. And that is very much a conservative, read that, Republican viewpoint. And I'm sure you must have some Democrats who support this notion, but my guess would be that it is an overwhelmingly Republican initiative.
Yeah, I would say it is an overwhelmingly conservative and Republican-driven initiative. Here's what I mean, and I would defend this to the end, that it's bipartisan. I live in California. It's a very left-leaning state. California, folks in California have recently, and I mean very recently, discovered the concept of federalism. They don't like the idea of a President Trump and a Republican Congress and a 5-member majority conservative Supreme Court telling them what to do. And suddenly they're pushing back against it. They're talking about, believe it or not, secession
yes,
here in California.
I thought that was rather ironic. Jerry Brown, of all people.
Right. So my point is this is why it is bipartisan. In a lot of ways, I support the idea that the federal government shouldn't be telling California what to do. In the same way that when we had the Obama administration, they shouldn't be telling Texas what to do. And a lot of the division that we see in this country today, and I'm sick and tired of it as anybody is caused because so many big decisions about our lives are being made in Washington, D.C. When you do that, you're going to anger 50% of the people in this country, invariably. So it is time to take the power away from D.C. and to return it to where the founders intended it to be, which is mostly at the state level.
And we're talking with Mark Meckler. He's president of Citizens for Self-Governance, their website, conventionofstates.com. This won't take long, so let's just go to the authorization. I will read to you the relevant portions of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. All right. Any thoughts you offer, Mark Meckler, regarding the rule book that I just spelled out and what opportunities and or difficulties that may present?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties, or at least one of the complaints I hear from people on a pretty regular basis, and I understand this, is that's pretty simple. There's not a lot there about how all this stuff will work and what exactly happens. And I think there's an important historic context for that. All the men who were at the convention in 1787, virtually all of them, had participated in previous conventions. This was a common mode of operation early on in the history of the country. And so there were 11 conventions known before the 1787 convention. They knew how conventions operated. In fact, there are a lot of things like this in the Constitution. The idea of due process, and how we know what due process means. You get a trial by jury of your peers. It's a unanimous verdict in a criminal case. All of those things are not actually said in the Constitution, but we know from original intent what was meant. The same is true with the Article 5 process.
We have a call from Bruce in Essex, Massachusetts on the Jim Bohannon Show with Mark Meckler of conventionofstates.com. Hi, Bruce.
Jim, I've called before on the same subject. First of all, people should understand that never in the history of this country has there ever been a constitutional convention. The fathers joined to consider the Articles of Confederation. The invitations that were sent out specifically said that they were going to meet to discuss changes to the Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. And then once they began, it apparently became very quickly understood that it was impossible to do, and they decided to prepare the Constitution.
I need to jump
All
in
right,
here.
let's let our guest respond to that.
Yeah,
keeping in mind one thing here, and that is that this country was on the verge of falling apart at that point. In terms of governance, it was the biggest crisis in the history of this country. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, and so, this is a common misconception. This is actually what I would call fake history. And I would encourage you, Bruce, to go back, look at our website, and actually read the documents that each of those men brought with them to that convention. They exist. In fact, it's really interesting. They weren't pulled from the National Archives, those documents, the actual commissions, until less than 10 years ago. And if you read them, every one of those commissioners carried a document with them that had this language in it. It said, "The commissioner shall take any and all actions necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union." It didn't mention the Articles of Confederation. It didn't mention amending the Articles of Confederation. And important to remember, the word Constitution in 1787 actually meant form of government, because there was no document called the Constitution. What each of these men was instructed by their states was to fix the government. As Jim said, it was the most tremendous crisis ever in American history. Colonies were getting ready, or states were getting ready to go to war against each other. Where this idea comes from, that it was actually to amend the Articles, was Congress did what Congress still does today. They followed the parade. After 7 states had actually prepared their commissions for their commissioners, Congress jumped in and said, hey, we like this idea, and they issued what they even called was a recommendation that the states do indeed get together, and they used the same language, but they also said to amend the Articles of Confederation, but Congress had no authority under the Articles of Confederation to even call a convention. So
there was not a mechanism under the Articles of Confederation. There was not a mechanism for change.
That is correct. And so this was the states sent these men, and this is another thing that's really important to me, Jim. We're talking about the Founding Fathers. And I think it's just outrageous that people would say that these men of great honor and integrity, at a time when honor and integrity actually really meant something in society, that they went there and just decided to blow off what they had been sent to do. They just got together and said, hey, you know what, we don't like that idea. We're going to do whatever we want. That's not the real history. It's not how it happened.
All right. More to come. Stay with us. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. This is going to happen. That seems pretty clear by now. Currently, 12 states have passed identical Convention of States resolutions that call for fiscal restraint, limiting the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government, as well as term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. So that's 12 down, and that would leave 22 to go. And we'll see just exactly how far it goes and take more of your calls at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. 826. Mark Meckler is the president of Citizens for Self-Governance. The website again, conventionofstates.com. You have 3 million supporters now nationwide in every state house district nationwide, and also 12 states have passed identical Convention of States resolutions. So this would seem to indicate to me that any questions about this happening are probably moot at this point. It looks like it's going to happen, don't you think?
Yeah, I'm 100% sure it's going to happen. Exactly when we get it all done, it's hard to say. But right now, I think it's a reasonable projection to say we ought to hit 34 in 2019.
Interesting. Just leading up to the presidential election. All right, Beverly in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Hello, Beverly.
Mr. Bohannon, I really enjoy your shows every night. I always learn a lot.
Thank you.
I guess we should take one thing at a time, but I have always wanted to get rid of that electoral college. And I'll just hang up. And that's my comment. So I'll just hang up and listen.
Okay. Is that one of the potential proposals, or what are the ground rules for what can be proposed here?
Yeah, first of all, just historically, I'm not a fan of getting rid of the Electoral College. That empowers nothing but huge urban districts. That's where the election would be fought. That's the only thing that would matter. It's where the big population centers are. It would radically disempower the smaller states.
Although, of course, today, obviously, presidential campaigns are pretty well waged in, maybe 15 or at the most 20 states. I mean, nobody's going to campaign in Texas or California. If you're a Democrat and you've got a campaign in California, you've already lost the election. If you're a Republican and you have to campaign in Texas, you've already lost the election, even though there are millions of Republican voters in California and millions of Democratic voters in Texas.
Right, and so what would happen is it would flip that on its head. In fact, the only place you would need to campaign is where the huge population bases are.
Not really. You'd need every vote would count under that circumstance. Anyway,
but if you look at states, like Nebraska with a population under 1 million, it wouldn't be worth a candidate's time.
Nebraska has about 1.5 million. They have about 1/2 of 1% of the population of the country. But anyway, not turning this into a big argument about the Electoral College, since that's not one of the things that are being brought up here.
And as Jim, as a matter of authority, in this convention, we wouldn't be able to talk about that, because the only thing we can talk about in the convention are things that limit the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. And changing the electoral system does not do that.
So, again, we've talked about these identical Convention of States resolutions, which call for fiscal restraint, which I assume includes a balanced budget amendment of some sort, or as I personally support, a surplus budget amendment, which under ordinary circumstances would compel the budget process, if we ever get one, to commit 1% of federal revenues to the national debt. So that would be one of the areas. Limiting the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government, term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. Of course, there are already term limits on the president and the vice president. We'll get into some of the other things that would fall under the category of size, scope, and jurisdiction of Uncle Sam in a moment. Here's Karen in Watertown, New York. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
My question for Mark. Here in New York, of course, we all know it's very heavily unionized. The union is pushing a big campaign here for no against the convention, because they're spreading, getting their union members all scared that this is going to allow Cuomo and the legislature to get rid of their pensions and take the money out. And it's all the
Well, that has nothing to do with
these.
These were state pensions, right?
Yeah.
A federal constitutional convention wouldn't deal with what New York did about state pensions. That would, their business.
That's what they're pushing.
Well, I'll put it this way. If you're gonna lie about this convention, Mark, you ought to at least make up something that's plausible.
Well,
that's what I tried to tell.
Well, let's let our guests respond to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about, and here's where the confusion comes from. Right now, there is a fight going on in New York as well to hold a convention to amend the state constitution. So that's probably what we're referring to here. There is that fight going on.
And every state constitution has an amendment process.
There you go.
So that is probably what they're talking about. And that would be, of course, very much a measure of what a state constitutional convention might cover. This would only be a federal constitutional convention. All right, Karen, let's go to this notion here of amendments or proposed amendments which would limit the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government. What would that include here? What are we talking about? Any specific examples?
Yeah, for me, this is the most important one. Senator Tom Coburn works with us, and most people will remember that he was a physician before he was a senator. One of the things he says is, as a physician, it was his obligation to try to treat the disease and not the symptoms. The reason that the federal spending is so out of control is because government is so huge, and its scope and its jurisdiction are too large. The reason that we need term limits is because government is so big and so powerful, it's profitable for these guys to go there and spend their time there. So the most important thing is to limit the power of the federal government. It's been expanded well beyond the enumerated powers specified in the Constitution. The best example I can give you, Jim, is the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was designed to give the federal government a very narrow, tight power to regulate the shipment of goods across state lines. Today, that's been expanded to include everything, and in fact, the EPA, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce all get their authority from Supreme Court interpretations of that Commerce Clause. We could restrict the interpretation of the Commerce Clause back to its original meaning, and those departments would literally no longer exist.
Now, I'll just read it. This is very brief. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 states that the Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Okay, I'll give you an example of how this Commerce Clause has been brought about. From the moment I entered radio, I've been covered by the federal minimum wage. That's true in recent years. My pay has been a bit above the minimum wage, but when I began, it was covered by the federal minimum wage and this Commerce Clause. Now, it covered my first two jobs. One was working in a warehouse, and it was in a warehouse. This was a wholesale grocery company, and there were trucks involved that traveled and carried these groceries. Those trucks never left the state of Missouri, ever. But they were covered nonetheless, and the work at that particular location was covered by the federal minimum wage by virtue of the interpretation of the Commerce Clause, even though among the several states, believe me, nothing in that warehouse ever left the state of Missouri. Likewise, the radio station that I first worked at, also covered by that minimum wage, and they all are today, the signal from that particular station could not, on the best possible day, ever have approached the border of the state of Missouri. So those first two jobs I had both had nothing to do with anything outside the state of Missouri, and yet both were covered by the federal minimum wage by this interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, and the founders would have been appalled. It's important, we talk about original intent, those of us who love the Constitution. It's important we look at what did they mean, and words had specific meanings back then. Sometimes they're different than what they mean now. One of the great examples of that is the word commerce itself. In 1787, the word commerce actually meant the shipment of goods. Today we say commerce, we think business, but that's not what the founders meant when they wrote it. And the word regulate meant something completely different. Today we think of regulations, bureaucracies, the control of government. Regulate back in 1787 meant to regularize or to smooth out. All they were trying to do was prevent trade wars between the states. That was the authority that was granted to
and which
Congress.
Was happening under the Articles of Confederation.
In fact, New York and New Jersey at the time that was drafted were on the verge of an actual military war over trade conflicts.
All right, more to come as we continue to look at just what an Article 5 Constitutional Convention of the States would entail. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. The website, conventionofstates.com. And this would be aimed at a lot of things that are long overdue as reforms. Term limits, making sure that Congress can pass no laws affecting Congress that don't affect the people equally or vice versa. No budget, no pay, and a number of other issues which frankly would never make it through Congress. And so the traditional method of amending the Constitution simply wouldn't work. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show. Mark Meckler is president of Citizens for Self-Governance. This is the leading force behind the notion of an Article 5 Convention of States. All right. You reach the point where 34 states have passed identical Convention of States resolutions. At that point, what happens? Do they are those resolutions sent to to Congress? I mean, what body says, okay, we've hit the requisite number?
Yeah, in fact, they're being sent to Congress as they pass. So it depends on the state who does it in a given state, but generally the Secretary of State certifies it, sends it off to Congress, and those are being compiled in Congress right now as each state passes. At
such time as we hit 34, which you estimate will happen probably in 2019, and then Congress is required to do something. Are they required to say, okay, we're going to have a convention. It'll be August the 17th in Dallas or whatever. I mean, what at that point, what happens?
That is exactly correct. So Congress has what's called, from a legal perspective, an administrative or ministerial duty. They're essentially acting as a secretary for the states. They say we've got 34, and they are required to name the time and place. And it is a requirement. It says shall call. And so they name the time and place. Jim, I have no doubt they'll name the time and place. It'll be in Washington, D.C. And every state leader that I've talked to around the country as we do this has said, we will go there, we will convene for one day, we'll gavel it out, and we'll go back somewhere in the middle of the country and hold our convention.
Interesting. Okay. At that point, then, what are the ground rules under what comes up? Now, these resolutions, we note that the 12 that have passed are identical Convention of States resolutions. So I gather that if, for example, you got, let's say, 34 state resolutions, but only 31 of them were identical, you'd still be 3 short?
Yeah, that's correct. No convention until you get to 34. In fact, there have been over 400 of these resolutions passed throughout American history. We've just never had 34 of them that are the same.
All right. So then, so once you get it decided and they convene very possibly in Washington and then they immediately vote to reconvene, what are the limits on what this body can recommend? Are they restricted to what is spelled out in the Convention of States resolutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So in other words, that's the law of convention because each state only gave the authority for a convening for those topics. So anything that anybody would try to discuss outside those topics is what's called non-germane. And in standard legislative parlance, somebody could raise a point of order if somebody said something that had nothing to do with those and say, point of order, that's out of order for this convention. And it would be so indicated to be out of order because they are limited by their resolutions.
How many delegates from each state, and who picks those delegates?
This, to me, is one of the best parts of this whole thing. It's purely federalist, and what I mean by that is each state decides how many delegates they'll send. Each state decides how they will pick those delegates, but each state gets one vote out of their delegation once they get to convention.
So, in other words, California, with 70 times the population of Wyoming, would have the same vote.
Same exact vote, but they might send, I like to joke, Jim, I live here in California, Northern California, they're going to send a psychedelic bus full of stoned hippies, probably.
Well, they might, but I mean, that fact notwithstanding. I'll put it this way. I consider that a major flaw, but nonetheless, to get these things considered, that's worthwhile. But that's not certainly something that makes me thrilled.
Well,
the notion that people, if you're from a small state, that you're somehow deemed superior to people from a big state.
Well, here's the reason. And practically speaking, the smaller states would simply not participate if the large states could overwhelm them. And so you could never get to a quorum. It's just not something they would ever do if they knew that they would have no say because the larger states would overwhelm.
Well, I mean, there's and let's not forget that the one part of the Constitution that is unamendable is the U.S. Senate.
Correct. So this was part of the Great Compromise to bring the small states into the Union.
All right, stay with us. More to come. 1-866-50-JIMBO. An Article 5 Constitutional Convention of States. It's coming. And we'll take a look at just what could come from that. Mark Meckler is president of Citizens for Self-Governance. ConventionOfStates.com, the website. Back in a moment. Mark Meckler is president of Citizens for Self-Governance. Now, in one of the releases that you've put out, I'll just quote from this here. momentum continues to build to use this constitutional tool before it is too late. Too late for what? What's the expiration date on all of this?
Well, I think the problem is that the administrative state and the federal government are getting so powerful, and we're losing so many of our rights. There's no expiration date. It's just, I think the time is short before the republic as we know it ceases to exist.
So let's say that you didn't get your 34 states by 2019. Let's say that you didn't reach the total until 2029. I mean, would those original ratifications or recommendations still count?
Well, first of all, I'd be getting really old, Jim, so you'd have to be worried about me. But other than that, yes, they still count. The way it works is those ratifications or those resolutions stay on the books until a state rescinds them. The one exception to that is a state can put a sunset clause on their particular resolution, and out of the 12 that have passed so far, 2 states have actually done that.
How many states have done that?
2 states have done it, and those states have 5-year sunset clauses in them, which means they would need to renew that resolution 5 years after passage.
So 5 years from now, then you'd be down to 10 states if nothing happened.
Yep.
All right. Very good. What else about this project should we be aware of that I haven't brought up?
You know, I think the most important thing are 2 things that I would call sort of generalities. The first thing is to understand that the founders thought it would be really important for us to have the power to bypass the federal government in restraining the federal government. To them, it was just common sense, this idea that they knew from history that any centralized government will literally always, at some point, become a tyranny in some measure, and that the people needed the power. And so the most important thing to know is we actually have the power. We can ignore Congress, we can ignore the courts, we can ignore the president. We can fix the problems that ail the nation. We don't have to look to Washington, D.C. to fix the problems. Right. I think that's a really big deal.
Now, at one point, I know that this has been mentioned. Whether it's been mentioned in the context of this particular convention, I'm not sure. But I know that there was a proposal that has been talked about which would allow, if I'm not mistaken, a majority of state legislatures to overturn Supreme Court decisions?
Well, it is theoretically possible, yeah. I mean, it depends on the proposal that's put forth in convention. I've heard people propose that there's what they call a 3/5 amendment, where 3/5 of states could vote to overturn a Supreme Court decision within a certain period of time. There's all kinds of different proposals, but certainly the states could, and I believe should, be given the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions.
And this convention would go proposed amendment by proposed amendment, right? And if it passed, then it would go on for ratification. If it didn't, it would hit the trash can.
That's correct. And so it would be very similar to, for example, the way the Bill of Rights came out of the Congress. 12 items were in the Bill of Rights. That it wasn't even called the Bill of Rights back then. There were just 12 proposed amendments. They went out to the states for ratification, and only 10 of them were ratified. So they're ratified one by one by the states.
All right. Very good. Anyway, stay on the line. We'll speak off air. Mark Meckler is president of Citizens for Self-Governance. Their website is conventionofstates.com. And now with 3 million supporters in every state House district nationwide, with 12 states having passed identical Convention of States resolutions, it appears this will probably happen. Their best estimate may be in the year 2019.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.